Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Brookings India. My name is Shamika Ravi. I'm a senior fellow in governance and economics. I'm also the research director at the institution here. Welcome to this very exciting development seminar on regulating a digital economy. This is very topical, and I think it impacts every aspect of life today across different sectors. We have a very interesting lineup of speakers today. P Meltzer, who's a senior fellow at Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institution in Washington, will make a presentation. And Josh really straddles the two very interesting worlds of law and trade. And he will be presenting his latest paper on the topic. And the discussants today will start with Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, who was in the IFS for several years, and he was India's ambassador and permanent representative at the UN before he retired. And Ashok will give us a sense of how foreign policy and cybersecurity issues are impacted from the digital economy perspective. It'll be followed by Professor Mudit Kapoor from the Indian Statistical Institute. Mudit has been working on, Mudit is basically an econometrician by training, but he has been working on health analytics and the digital economy, regulating aggregators such as Uber, etc. And then we will have Avik, who will join us in a few minutes. He's on his way, who heads the analytics arm of the Niti Aayog. So he will tell us about what the government initiatives are in this area. So Josh, if I may request you to start the event by making presentation of your paper, please. You have 20 minutes. Just.
Great. Thank you, Shamika, for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the paper. I think there are hard copies out the front if anyone hasn't grabbed one yet. The basic premise in this paper is that sort of data, global internet connectivity and data are basically transforming how economic growth happens and how international trade is engaged in, and that these are broad economy-wide opportunities. At the same time, we're seeing a range of government regulations, not only in India but across Asia, essentially forms of data localization, which are having an impact on these economic and trade opportunities. In the paper, we look at the various reasons that are driving most of these data localization laws, and we certainly are not saying that regulation is not important or necessary. For instance, we're quite explicit about the importance of, strong privacy protection. We're simply making the claim, though, that often data localization is suboptimal, both in terms of actually achieving legitimate regulatory goals and also because of its impact on the economic potential. And so the paper sort of lays out sort of a broad sort of high-level framework in terms of how do you think about these regulatory goals and aims, legitimate and not so legitimate, and what might be a way of thinking through getting to an optimal sort of regulatory environment. So I'm going to I've got a slide deck here. I'll go through some of it more or less rapidly so we can have some time for conversation at the end. Just the observation here, obviously we've got internet connectivity and it's mobile. I think I just want to make the point here that, this is not about the IT sector. It's not about, Alibaba or Google or Facebook or Amazon. This is really about the use by businesses and economic sectors across an economy of digital technology. So this is very much about the services sector. It's very much about how the agriculture sector can be digital. It's about manufacturing. In a sense, this is really an economy-wide agenda. And we'll talk more about what this means for international trade. So obviously, these are in the paper. These are the countries that we look at in more detail. Obviously, we'll be focusing on India today. I mean, as I'm sure this audience knows, internet penetration, while significant in absolute terms, is still very low. In fact, in India, and it just shows, I think, the challenges and the opportunities in this country. This graph picks up simply the growth in data flows globally over the last 10 years. So we've seen a 45-fold increase in data flows globally, and the estimates are that this will continue on a similar pathway going forward, and it just underpins the importance of data and cross-border data flows for what we begin to understand as the digital economy. So just getting a handle on some of the sort of economic opportunities globally, and also for India specifically, this captures, I think, some of the best data really out there at the moment by a variety of organisations of the significance of this. And it just gives you a sense of the scope. So, McKinsey's estimated that global data flows raised GDP by 3.5%, which, was about $2.8 trillion in 2014, could be $11 trillion opportunity by 2025. And just to give you a comparison point, in 2014, that is more than global trade in goods. So it gives you a sense that data flows from an economic and trade perspective are potentially more important now than actual trade in physical commodities. The World Bank's done a variety of studies looking at the connection between internet access and exports, and they keep showing robust connections between, internet penetration and export opportunity. The United States International Trade Commission has looked at this specifically in the US context and shown, very robust outcomes from the broad expansion of internet access and data use in the United States. Interestingly, in that study, they found that 75% of the gains for the US economy from data and internet were in the non-IT sector. So you think about the US as a sort of the prime internet economy, but still it reinforces my point, though, that really the gains are economy-wide. This is not just confined to an IT sector. And UNCTAD, in their report from last year, did a calculation about global e-commerce sales in 2015 of 25 trillion. I think that's obviously a very large number. I think as well, two things. One is that, and this is true broadly of the opportunities of the internet economy, as we think about the consumer-facing side of this, because that's obviously what we focus on, what the media focuses on, but really this is a B2B opportunity at heart. And even in these e-commerce figures, 90% of that is B2B rather than B2C. And they had figures on the cross-border element of the B2C of 189 billion, and that's obviously going to be significantly larger on the B2B side as well. In terms of India, so, the data's sparse. The digital economy is estimated to contribute, $500 to $1 trillion in GDP by 2025, and 1.5 to 2 million jobs by the end of this year, though the expectation is that there's actually a lost opportunity in India already over the last decade or so of not going digital of over $1 trillion. In many respects, the macro impacts are on productivity. It's the way businesses use data, new business models. It's the opportunity for businesses to be more efficient and more competitive, whether it's through, low-cost communication devices, email, obviously, but increasingly, cloud computing, the use of data, to generate better business efficiencies and results. It's very much about services being digital and manufacturing. I think in the Indian context, that's obviously very significant. There's a robust services sector in India, which is, increasingly online. And, you marry this with the government's sort of, made in India strategy. And this doesn't really work if it's not a digital strategy. Manufacturing is increasingly about using data, global connectivity and the like to really be effective and efficient. And this is a direction India clearly has to go to if it's going to sort of fulfill, I think, some of those manufacturing goals. I've got a couple of graphs here which again pick up some of the key data points just to give you a sense of the value and where India is currently at. This picks up employment, and you can sort of see that in absolute numbers, and this is in the information and communication services sector, India's got a very absolute large number, more than Japan, and not significantly less though than the EU and the US. And there's a share of total employment, though quite low. And I think it just points to the employment opportunities. And this is just is one sector that's digitally intensive. And here you get a sense of the value added of ICT services for India. And again, I think what's significant is that at 4.5% of GDP. Comparatively, it's actually very high. It's very significant when you look at it, compared to some of the very large developed economies. So it shows that India, is already performing well in a value-added sense, and again, the opportunities are significant. So I just want to give you a bit of a sense about the use of data and particularly the cross-border nature of it, and then we can transition into the more specific trade elements. Cloud computing, is one key development here, obviously, and you see that essentially, whether it's provided from a data center in the United States or a data center in Singapore, or locally provided, it's basically globally accessible opportunity for software and infrastructure to be enabled remotely. And it's hard to, I think, understate the importance of cloud computing, particularly for smaller businesses. Essentially, it's been compared to the telecommunications revolution in that, access to computing power has been a key differential between large companies and small companies. And you can now be a small company and essentially have the same type of computational capacity as any other large company. It's scalable, it's on demand, you don't have to have expensive sort of standalone, IT sectors. It's safer, it's more secure than anything you can do yourself domestically. And so it's potentially an absolute game change of how companies operate, as long as you can access these services at cutting edge and low cost prices. Internet of Things is a new development we're familiar with, the use of sensors on things to do a whole bunch of stuff. This just picks up some of the cross-border nature of it in terms of logistics, just-in-time manufacturing, and this is really key for global value chains, and often this is also tied to the cloud. And big data, this is just one stylized example of how you see companies basically using open innovation networks to allow collaboration across borders to develop products more efficiently. BMW's got an open innovation network which allows them which basically allows contribution from outside BMW into the design of new features for new cars. It's been demonstrated to produce outcomes which they actually turn into products 50% quicker than they did previously. Pharmaceutical companies are doing this for drug trials and you see it happening across industries. But for it to work efficiently, it's heavily dependent on the cross-border flow of information. So a lot of this then sort of translates into some significant transformations in international trade, and I sort of identify 4 of them. Platform services, the services value added, particularly in manufacturing and global value chain. So the platform notion is fairly straightforward, and we've probably all had some familiarity with it, where you essentially, you're a business, you're online and you're reaching customers globally. And again, this is a really significant small business opportunity. This is data that eBay has produced, which basically shows if you are a small business on the eBay platform, and I've highlighted the data for India there, which basically shows that 95% of small businesses on eBay are exporting, compared to 10% of their equivalents offline. And you can see that this translates in similar numbers, across Asia for companies on these platforms. So the opportunities and the way that it's essentially democratizing and creating new space for companies that were traditionally shut out of international trade to participate in the international economy is potentially very significant. On the trade and services side, again, this is, I think, a real example of opportunities for India, particularly as services, a digital, professional, computer, software, a lot of the back-end processing that India does so well is increasingly provided cross-border and online. Actually, in fact, we have... the data actually shows that, the vast majority of, India's sort of IT and IT-enabled services are actually provided online and across border, and essentially are entirely dependent on the free flow of data across border. And we'll have some, and so the digitization of goods is another element here which is increasingly significant, and it's basically the notion that through the use of sensors and collecting data, companies are adding value to their traditional goods offerings. So I have an example I use often of Caterpillar, which is obviously a large earth-moving equipment company in the United States, which you think of as the sort of traditional large good that gets exported around the world. They have sensors located on their machinery, which in real time tracks sort of the grading as it's being used. It monitors vibrations in the machine to determine when parts are going to fail. It has parts delivered to these machines before they fail, so you absolutely minimise downtime. And all this data is being collected and analysed in real time back in the United States. Rolls-Royce, which manufactures jet engines, monitors as these engines as they fly for, changes in vibrations and temperatures. It sends the signals to the cockpit so they can adjust the actual sort of flight speed and the rest to maximise engine efficiencies. And actually, Rolls-Royce now, if you buy a jet engine from them, they actually sell a package of actually hours in the air. So you're not actually even buying specifically the good, you're buying essentially a service, which is they guarantee a certain amount of hours flown, which includes maintenance and the ongoing monitoring of the engine and the like. So you basically see that the value add is the jet turbine, but it's also all the other services associated with it that create the competitive differential with another company. And it inherently relies on data and data analysis to make this happen. And global value chains have essentially been a product of the IT revolution, in the communications one being key, but increasingly you see whether it's use of radio frequency identification devices to track products in transit, manage warehouses to have just-in-time sort of production and the like, is absolutely integrated with data and the movement of data across economies. This simply, points to India's sort of backward linkages and forward linkages, and the more crucial one really being the backward linkages data, which is essentially the extent that India actually incorporates other products into further manufacturing in India and then sort of exports them onwards. And you can see that India is in the process of integrating into global value chains, but compared to other Asian countries which are much more integrated, you have backward linkages, for instance, in Korea and in Malaysia, upwards of 40-50%, and in India's in the 20-odd% range. So there's obviously a lot of significant growth there, and I know the governments recognise this as a challenge. This gets at some of the data on the importance of services exports, and just reinforces the point here. 40% of India's goods and services exports consist of software services and IT-enabled services. 65% of India's IT and IT-enabled exports are actually delivered across border and online. 15% are through commercial presence, so through investments in other countries, but that also deeply relies on cross-border data flows to allow the delivery of services which are the content being created in India, but just sort of delivered through these investments in overseas countries. So we see, this is basically mapping out the opportunities, I think, for India and the economic opportunities. This looks at, just an overview of some of the, data flow barriers and restrictions that we've seen being introduced in various ways in India. So when I talk about, data localization or data restrictions, there's a whole sort of spectrum of this. It's, at one end, you've got requirements where you just have to keep your data locally and it can't be moved to another country. You have but then there's a gradation where you have various restrictions on the capacity to move it. So, for instance, you go to another end where privacy in various privacy regulation in various forms is restriction on the movement of data. For instance, if you look at how the EU has designed its privacy regime, essentially they prohibit the movement of personal data outside of the EU unless another country has an adequacy finding. So it's possible in some circumstances, but there are various barriers and hurdles that need to be overcome. There are other requirements which may require copies to be stored or processing to happen only locally. And so there's a variety of data restrictions. Now, I want to repeat here, I'm not making a sort of a normative statement about whether this is desirable or not. I think I'm just pointing out that this is actually happening. And then there's a question about, is this an optimal sort of way in order to achieve legitimate regulatory goals? And so the cost of these data restrictions, I think, flows naturally from understanding the importance of cross-border data flows for enabling the economic and trade opportunities. Specifically, you see that increasingly business models are built around data collection and gathering and using that in a sort of effective and smart way to deliver new goods and services, and that places additional costs on achieving that. Delivery, just-in-time delivery is predicated on the ability to move data globally and analyse it effectively. You can force businesses to make investment decisions which are suboptimal. So in an extreme case where you require the building of local data centres, then you can create unnecessary costs. You reduce the broader sort of economic efficiencies of the internet as well. So this goes through what we've identified in the paper as some of the key drivers of data localisation measures, and we've identified these 5, and we'll look at them in a little bit more detail. Before we do that, there's one. There's getting a handle on the actual costs of data localization for India. This is one set of data which sort of, it actually doesn't pick up the more recent data localization measures like the proposed Reserve Bank of India data localization on payments solutions, but basically said that some of the proposed measures would reduce Indian GDP by 0.1%, but applied in an economy-wide sense would actually reduce Indian GDP by up to 0.8%, which is actually becoming very significant. And even under the smaller data localization set of proposed measures would still reduce investment by 1.4%. I put this statement up here because I think this captures the basic framework that we've been using for thinking about, well, so how do you think about an optimal design for regulation for a digital economy? And here it is: ensure the realisation of legitimate regulatory goals such as privacy and security while maximising the economic and trade opportunities of cross-border data flows. And the OECD, to some extent, puts it in a slightly different way: reduce risk to an acceptable level relative to the economic and social benefits expected from these activities. So, it's inherent in this notion that there are at times trade-offs. Sometimes the trade-offs aren't as real as they appear, but you're balancing between different objectives and how do you optimise both of them. So looking more specifically at the privacy issue, so the basic notion for privacy is that, don't send personal data to another jurisdiction if it's going to be eroded because that jurisdiction's got lower levels of domestic privacy. And, that's certainly, the EU approach with the data directive and the GDPR is basically that. The US has got a different approach to privacy, which is essentially requires companies to, publish privacy laws, commit to essentially treating data consistent with those laws, and then the companies are themselves accountable for that data, whether or not it's held domestically in the US or moved to a third country. So managing the risks and maximising the opportunities. As I said at the beginning, I think the digital economy is going to require robust privacy laws. Consumers, businesses, everyone needs trust in engaging and delivering online. And, we just point out, obviously, there's a process underway in India, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with in terms of developing a privacy regime for India. There is, at the same time, also some important developments in terms of enabling cross-border data flows on the privacy front. So APEC has done some very important work into creating a system of cross-border privacy rules. The Privacy Shield arrangement between the United States and the EU is a very important model, we think, for how you might think about interoperability among very different privacy regimes. And in fact, there's a regulatory bargain in the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP. I know India is obviously not a party to that agreement, but also which provides a framework for thinking about how to move forward on some of these issues. Because in the TPP, essentially there is a commitment by countries to the free flow of data across borders. There's an exception for privacy, but also very importantly, each country commits to not only have in place privacy laws, but also to apply those privacy laws to all users of e-commerce. So in a sense, it's a commitment both on the data exporter to allow that data to flow, but also on the data importer to treat that data consistent with their domestic privacy laws, but also to apply those laws not just to data from their own country, but to all data. And we think that's kind of an important way of thinking about creating obligations on both sides to sort of finding a way through this privacy and data flow issue. Cybersecurity, obviously very important and topical. There's basically this notion that if you store data domestically, the data is more secure. We actually think that if you look at this from a risk assessment perspective, that doesn't necessarily bear out. In many respects, data is increasingly being held actually in cloud computing centres, and particularly cloud, which is sort of being operated by the most sophisticated, most professional entities, have essentially disaggregated, dispersed data centres around the world, and it is often this distributed data which actually increases security, not decreases it, often actually forcing data into sort of local data centres. It concentrates it, which means it's more vulnerable. It's more vulnerable to attack by outside interests. It's more vulnerable to spying on by governments. And there are a whole variety of other risks which go into where an appropriate data centre should be located, and it's not necessarily clear that you're going to get an optimal outcome from a cybersecurity perspective by requiring it to be held in country. So we just have some general ideas which we go into a bit more detail in the paper about the importance for cooperation between essentially government and the private sector, particularly on the critical infrastructure sectors. We talk about the importance of data encryption and up-to-date software, fragmenting across data centres being an important component of it. And when you think about resilience and data recovery, so in the case that there's anything from a natural disaster to a cyber attack, recovering your data can also often require having had multiple copies stored in other locations. That might be in a country, but it might be overseas. So again, it just gets to the notion of absolutely cybersecurity is important, but just thinking that localizing it is your optimal solution doesn't necessarily bear out. Law enforcement, again, there is a view, understandably, of look at we're fighting terrorism and the like. We need access to particular data immediately, but that data is being held in another jurisdiction. Getting access to that data then slows down law enforcement purposes. This is actually a well understood problem. There is a series. The mutual MLATs, the legal treaties, are the sort of way that traditionally data has been requested from other jurisdictions. These were not designed for a digital age when large amounts of data can be stored overseas, and so they're very slow and cumbersome. And in fact, often because a lot of data is stored in the United States, the US is a bit of a bottleneck on this in terms of actually, the US is quite slow in terms of processing data and getting it out. We made a couple of recommendations. One is I think everyone understands the MLAT process needs to be reformed. Importantly, you can also negotiate bilateral data sharing agreements for these types of purposes specifically, which is something that the US and the UK have been doing. The US has implemented more recently the Cloud Act, which provides basically a window, I think, for instance, US and India to develop their own bilateral mechanisms of exchange. And so we basically make the point that there are avenues which governments need to be think of beyond the immediate require data to be held in country to actually enable those types of exchanges to occur. And we just make an important point, I think, about avoiding backdoors because trust remains very important. Regulation of OTT players is another issue which comes up, and it's basically the notion here that you have a lot of these over-top services using existing telecommunications infrastructure to provide a lot of key digital services, and the telecoms companies often make the claim that, look, they're not paying into a fund, or they're not paying the same licensing fees, and they should be, right, because they're using the infrastructure. And, we basically make the point that it's not clear that there is actually a cost to infrastructure from OTT. And actually the OECD work shows there's this virtuous cycle, whereas these OTT players are themselves building out their own infrastructure, bringing the content closer to the consumer to minimise latency and the like. That's actually improving the type of service that consumers want, which can then lead to increasing demand for broadband and the like, and you get this virtuous cycle of infrastructure development. So actually, India's been quite progressive in some of these areas. It's got a unified licensing for traditional and OTT providers, but it just sort of shows that it's creative thinking around the convergence that's happening between traditional and more new and data-driven services is a key element of what's happening here. And finally, digital protectionism, which I don't think is a legitimate regulatory goal, is something that we see in a lot of the world. China, being an absolute standout case, but not alone. And basically, there's the idea that you want to develop digital champions, so you degrade internet access, you block internet access, you don't allow competitors in. And China's been doing this for a while now. USTR estimates that they block access to about 3,000 websites, including 11 of the top 25 global sites. This raises WTO issues, and in fact, the US is beginning to raise potential WTO litigation around some of China's internet practices. It leads to essentially copycat behaviour and retaliation. So if you're a significant digital exporter, which India actually is, then you also, I think, need to be concerned about, how other countries start restricting data flows and the like, because, there's clear economic interest there. And it really just ignores the basic point that we make, which is that the key value for economies is going to be data and data services as inputs, as enablers to economy-wide improvements. So the focus should not be let's copy Silicon Valley. The focus should be on how do we just use these services most effectively? How do we create an enabling environment to develop our own domestic content and our own domestic startups, but one which is not premised around simply, we want another Facebook, we want another Amazon. Because the gains and the benefits from digital and data are really economy-wide and dispersed, and this is where government policy should be focused. This is basically the broad notion of building a digital economy. And because the paper is looking at Asia broadly, we just have some broad principles which we think should guide how regulators should think about this. I've done some more specific country work. We're finishing up some very detailed work, for instance, on the Australian economy and what their regulation should look like in order to maximise digital opportunities for that economy. We've done one for Colombia as well, so that can give you a sense of what this would look like in a more specific context. But it really goes into, you need regulation, but you need regulation that's fit for purpose for a 21st century digital economy. So you need to look very carefully at, you absolutely need an effective high-level comprehensive privacy law, but you also need to think about implementing that law in a way which maximises the opportunities for cross-border data flows. You want to have in place consumer protection laws. You need an adequate set of intellectual property laws which strike the right balance between the content providers and the internet service providers. You want to think about how your competition law works in a digital context. Governments have to play a key role themselves in going digital, using the procurement function to drive and the development of local content providers. You need an education system which is fit for purpose and which is providing the pathways for students and the next generation to take the next series of jobs that are going to be coming up. And you need all this to translate into a proactive digital trade policy, which is driven and tied to what your key sort of export interests are going to be in this area. And so I think that sort of captures our basic sort of view of what is needed when you think about how do you take this forward. Thank you.